President Biden's multi-state travel blitz continues this week with a series of stops in swing states. This as his campaign invests $30 million in a new national ad buy. It's all part of what the campaign is calling a month of action. In Atlanta last night, the president highlighted the contrast not just between him and his predecessor, but in the way that they see the two Americas.
Donald Trump sees a different America. An American story of resentment, revenge, and retribution. That's not me, that's not you. We see a future where we define democracy and defend it, not diminish it. We see a future where we defend the basic freedoms, not take them away.
Joining us now is former White House Chief of Staff for President Biden, Ron Klain. Welcome to the table, my friend. Good to have you.
Michael.
Absolutely.
Look at Ron Klain getting up early on a Sunday. We'd love to see it.
There you go.
Here with the people who remember to change their clocks.
Well, some of us. Ron, as people were talking about the State of the Union before, it happened, all the stakes were high. Is he going to talk about his age? I'm like, that's not what the State of the Union is about. But I was looking for, I told people, I said, the tour after is what you need to watch because Joe Biden cares a lot about that tour. Can you just talk about why, from the president's perspective and maybe the White House and the White House's right now, is this tour just as, if not even more important than what he did on the stage in the Capitol at the State of the Union on Tuesday?
Well, as you know, from being out on the road with him, Simone, the president loves to be out there connecting with voters, talking to people on rope lines, being able to have those one-to-one exchanges with people out where they live and addressing their concerns where they are. I think the State of the Union was more important, though. I do think it was a chance for him to speak to the entire country all at once, lay out what he wants to do as president, what he would do if he had 4 more years as president, persuade a persuasive, energetic agenda about what the future holds for the United States with Joe Biden as president. I thought he did a great job of that in the State of the Union. Now he has a chance to amplify that by going around the country, seeing people up close, talking to them in their own towns and states. And that's something he loves to do. He's a great campaigner. He loves campaigning.
There was a great headline, Ron Klain, in Playbook about how this was sort of the turn the tables State of the Union. I want to read you just a little bit from that. Over and over, Biden laid bait for Republicans. Over and over, they chomped on it, whether the topic was taxing billionaires or border security provisions in the bipartisan package the House GOP rejected. I wonder, what is the next bait that the president sets for the GOP?
Well, Alicia, I'm reminded of what Harry Truman once said when they said, Harry Truman, you're a give him hell, Harry. He said, I just tell the truth and people think it's hell. And I think Joe Biden's the same way. I think he's just out there explaining what he stands for. And the Republicans really don't have much of an answers to much of this. As we've seen, they've been struggling to explain why they oppose a bipartisan border security bill. The conservative Republican senators played a role in writing that would strengthen our protection at the border, make a fairer process on hearing asylum claims. And so I think that, the president's just laying it out there. He's laying out the facts. He's laying out what he's done as president. He's laying out what he would do if he had support in Congress. And if Republicans find that uncomfortable, that's because they put themselves in this dilemma.
You have a lot of interesting aspects of this campaign that have yet to unfold. And one of those is the opportunity for these two men, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, to face off. And I want you to listen very quickly to Donald Trump last night, who felt compelled on the heels of what he saw from the State of the Union to say this about a matchup between him and Joe Biden.
You were once the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. So I was struck by your direct comments to the Supreme Court, who are
but officially, for the good of our nation, it is time for crooked Joe Biden and myself to debate. We have to debate. It's for the good of our nation.
For the good of our nation, these two men should debate each other. Talk to us about your thoughts on that, and how does that look in light of what we saw the first time, and now where we are with both of these campaigns going into 24?
Look, President Biden's debated each time he's run for president, and he debated last time under the rubric of the Bipartisan Commission on Presidential Debate, which has sponsored the presidential general election debates in our country every election since 1988. And after the last debate, Trump said he would never participate in commission debates again. So I think it's really up to Donald Trump to make it clear he would agree to this long-standing way which we've conducted presidential debates in this country. Joe Biden's certainly happy to debate Donald Trump. He did it last time, went very well for the president. The current president went poorly for the former president. But, I think we'd have to know that Trump would agree to the right set of the basic structure that his predecessors have agreed to, and then he'll actually follow the rules this time. Last time, he tried his best to break the rules every way he could,
right.
And it was kind of a spectacle more than a debate.
It was very much so a spectacle. Ron, there is a belief of people in this town, and I think some of the donor chattering class across America, that really Joe Biden is scared of Donald Trump. He doesn't want to see him on a debate stage anywhere. And I think that there are some people that will say, yes, I heard Ron Klain say that Donald Trump needs to agree to the timelines, but the White House right now is not being clear on if they want to, if they really want to debate. They really don't want to get into it with Donald Trump.
I can assure you Joe Biden's not scared of Donald Trump. What I can assure you is Joe Biden's the only person in either political party who has beaten Donald Trump. Donald Trump ran against a stellar field of Republicans in 2016, beat them all, beat Secretary Clinton in 2016, and has now beaten a number of Republicans again. The only person who stood up and beaten Donald Trump in an election is Joe Biden. That's why he's the right person for the Democratic Party to nominate in 2024, to do the same thing again, to get reelected and to continue to serve the country as he has. And I think that's what the campaign will be all about.
Ron, we saw from the president a real appetite for embracing bipartisan negotiations on the border and on immigration. He visited the border last week. Was it a mistake in retrospect not to lean into this issue earlier during his first administration?
I think he has been working very hard on this issue throughout the 4 years. It's a very hard issue. We had a lot of chaos at the border the first 2 years of the last administration, until sadly the pandemic brought a quiet at the border. It brought a quiet in a lot of places, and so the president's been working on trying to use his executive authority to deal with the challenges at the border, and he also though did send to Congress, Alicia, on the first day he was in office on January 20th, 2020. He sent to Congress a comprehensive immigration bill to fix our immigration system, which is broken, which is not fair to people who are coming here with the right to come here, which doesn't do a good job of controlling the border. He proposed that on his very first day in office, and Congress never acted on it. So I'm glad that now at least some members of the House and Senate are prepared to move something forward. We need all members of the House and Senate to move something forward, to give the president the tools he needs to manage the border and to have a more efficient and humane immigration system.
It's the interesting thing about that issue, the border, for example, and how Republicans use and have used that issue against the Biden administration, sets up for me a number of storylines that have emerged, Ron, about how well people actually remember what happened when Donald Trump was president of the United States. The only thing that came out about the border at that time was build a wall that did not get built. And yet the narrative is sort of blown back on the president, President Biden. How does a campaign, from your long experience in this space, redefine that narrative? You have a lot of conversation, a lot of reporting out there, trying to get people to remember this is what happened during the Trump years, right? That part of the narrative seems to have broken down. I mean, you would agree, Simone. You and I have had this conversation on a number of occasions,
seems like people forgot how just chaotic it really was.
How bad it really was in a number of cases regarding, healthcare. Oh, let's talk about COVID. The border, let's talk about the wall. Infrastructure, let's talk about Infrastructure Week. How do you remind people of what those 4 years were like, as you had Katie Britt asking America, well, are you better off than you were 3 years ago? Yeah, but how about let's go back a little further than that and see how well we were doing then?
Well, I think, the best answer about the campaign is to have a campaign. And that's what the president is starting to kick off as we're heading into the campaign season. You'll see him out there more aggressively in the summer, in the fall, campaigning, framing up for voters what the choice is. And part of that is looking back at what it was like when Donald Trump was president, no question. But I think the most important of it is looking forward to what he would do with 4 more years and how much we can make progress on health care, on reproductive rights, on gun control, and all these other issues that are front and center for the country. So I do think the campaign will address what needs to be addressed in the campaign. I think that he's been governing. He's gotten good things done for the country. Now it's time to give voters a choice between, moving forward with Joe Biden or going back with Donald Trump. That's the choice the campaign will pose. And that's why we're going to have a campaign to do those things.
So you're really kind of talking about two things at once: the campaign doing that reminder thing, and the president's, job telling people where we're going.
Exactly.
Okay.